You feel it, don't you? Something has shifted, not just in politics, not just online, something deeper. You look around at the world and you think, has everyone lost their mind? Most people dismiss that feeling. They blame one side or the other. They point at politicians, at algorithms, at the news cycle. But what if I told you that what you're witnessing, this collective unraveling, was predicted with surgical precision over 70 years ago? Not by a political analyst, not by a futurist, but by a psychiatrist who'd already watched it happen once before. Carl Jung spent the last decades of his life trying to warn us. He had watched an entire civilization, one of the most educated, most culturally sophisticated nations in Europe, descend into what he called a psychic epidemic. Germany. He saw it from just across the river in Switzerland. And when it was over, when the smoke cleared, he didn't write about politics. He wrote about the human psyche. Because he understood something that most people still refuse to accept. The greatest threat to humanity has never been external. It has always been psychological. Today, I want to show you exactly what Jung saw. The mechanisms he identified, the warnings he gave, and why what is happening in our world right now follows his predictions almost to the letter. More importantly, I want to show you the one thing he said could actually protect you. Now, before we go further, I need you to understand something that Jung considered the single most important and most ignored insight of his entire career. And I've spent over 40 years studying this man's work. I've read his collected works cover to cover more than once, and I can tell you that everything he wrote circles back to what I'm about to share with you. We spend enormous resources protecting ourselves from physical threats. We build armies against invasion. We develop medicine against disease. We engineer against earthquakes and floods. Jung had no argument with any of that, but he made an observation that should stop you in your tracks. He wrote, and I want you to really hear this, "It is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes." Let that settle for a moment. And infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. Now, this was not hyperbole. Jung was many things, but he was not a man given to exaggeration. He had watched a psychic epidemic consume Germany. He had watched it from Basel, just minutes across a bridge. He wrote that what happened there was, and I'm quoting him directly, nothing less than an outbreak of epidemic insanity. No one knew what was happening to him, least of all the Germans, who allowed themselves to be driven to the slaughterhouse by their leading psychopaths like hypnotized sheep. Now here's what makes this so dangerous and so relevant to our time. When a society falls into what Jung called mass psychosis, the people living through it cannot see it. Think about that. Just as an individual who has gone mad cannot step outside his own mind to observe the errors in his thinking, an entire society gripped by psychic contagion has no vantage point from which to recognize what is happening. Everyone believes they're the sane one. Everyone believes the other side is the problem. Does that feel familiar? I'll let you sit with that for a moment. Now, to understand why the world seems to be going mad, you need to understand what Jung considered perhaps his most important discovery, the shadow. And I should tell you, in over 4 decades of studying and teaching Jung's work, I've come to believe that the shadow is the single most consequential idea in the history of psychology. Not the most famous, not the most popular, but the most consequential, because it explains something that nothing else quite can. In the shadow is not simply the dark side, That's a pop culture reduction that does Jung a great disservice. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is everything about yourself that you refuse to acknowledge, every quality you've disowned, every impulse you've buried, every capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for cowardice, that you've convinced yourself simply doesn't exist in you. Jung put it plainly. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Now let me show you the mechanism that actually drives what you see happening in the world around you. Because here's what most people miss entirely. When a person refuses to confront their shadow, that unacknowledged darkness doesn't simply vanish. The psyche won't allow it. It doesn't work that way. Instead, it gets projected outward. You begin to see your own darkness in other people. You attack it there. You rage against it there. You become absolutely convinced that the problem is entirely out there, in the other political party, in the other country, in the other group, in the other person." Jung described this with devastating clarity. He wrote, "We still attribute to the other fellow all the evil and inferior qualities that we do not like to recognize in ourselves, and therefore have to criticize and attack him. The world is still full of scapegoats, just as it formerly teemed with witches and werewolves." Do you see what he's saying? The mechanism hasn't changed in centuries. Only the targets have changed. We don't burn witches anymore, but the psychological process is identical. We find someone, some group, some ideology to carry the weight of our own unexamined darkness, and we feel righteous doing it. That's the part that should disturb you. We feel righteous. Now here is what Jung understood that almost no one talks about. When this projection happens on an individual level, it's a personal problem. You project your shadow onto your spouse, your colleague, your neighbor. Painful, but contained. But when millions of people are doing this simultaneously, when an entire society is projecting its shadow, you get something far more dangerous. You get what Jung called collective possession. He wrote one of the most chilling sentences in all of psychology, and I want you to hear it slowly, because it is the key to understanding everything happening around you right now. But he wrote, "When the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves." The world torn into opposing halves. Look around you. That is not a metaphor. That is a diagnosis from a man who had already watched it happen once. And he said something extraordinary about Germany that I think applies far more broadly than people realize. He wrote, "In Hitler, every German should have seen his own shadow, his own worst danger. It is everybody's allotted fate to become conscious of and learn to deal with this shadow. But how could the Germans be expected to understand this when nobody in the world can understand such a simple truth? Nobody in the world." He wasn't just talking about Germany. He was talking about a universal human failing, the refusal to look inward, the insistence that the darkness is always somewhere else. But the shadow is only half the story. There's a second mechanism at work that makes the shadow projection infinitely worse. And Jung wrote an entire book about it. I consider it the most prophetic work of psychology ever committed to paper. In 1957, Jung published The Undiscovered Self. And I want you to listen carefully to what he described, because he could have been writing about our world today. He described a process he called mass-mindedness. This is what happens when individuals stop thinking for themselves, when they surrender their moral judgment, their critical faculties, their capacity for independent reflection, to the crowd, to the group, and to whatever collective identity feels safest. Now, Jung was a clinician. He was precise about what he observed. He said that when a person merges with a crowd, Something measurable happens to their psychology. He wrote, "The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual. People become, and these are his words, not mine, morally and spiritually inferior. They become more unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, and unreliable." And worst of all, he wrote, "Crimes the individual alone could never stand are freely committed by the group." Now think about what has happened to us in the last 2 decades. Really think about it. We have built the most powerful mass-mindedness machines in human history. And I don't say that lightly. Social media doesn't merely connect people. It dissolves individuals into crowds. Algorithms don't show you truth. They show you what keeps you engaged, which almost always means what keeps you outraged, afraid, and tribal. Every time you scroll, every time you react, every time you share something in anger, you're participating in exactly the process Jung described, the dissolution of the individual into the mass. Jung warned, in 1957, mind you, decades before any of this technology existed, that the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. And then he said something that I find extraordinary, something I've turned over in my mind for years. He said, "A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one." Let that land. What he meant is this: when you strip the individual of their capacity for independent moral thought, when you reduce them to a member of a mass, it doesn't matter how large the group becomes. You haven't created strength. You've created vulnerability. You've created a population that can be led anywhere by anyone willing to exploit that vulnerability. And there is always someone willing to exploit it. Now I want to pause here for a moment. If what I've been describing resonates with you, if you've felt this pull of the crowd and sensed that something was deeply wrong with it, if you've had that nagging feeling that you're watching something unfold that you can't quite name, then I want you to know something. You're not alone in sensing it, and you're not imagining it. Jung mapped these dynamics with extraordinary precision, and there is so much more to explore than what I can cover in a single sitting. If this kind of depth, real Jungian psychology, not the surface-level self-help that gets passed around online, but the real substance of what this man spent his life uncovering, if that's something you want more of, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. Every video we make here is rooted in Jung's actual writings, his actual ideas. We go places most people won't go. So if this is speaking to something in you, stay with us. There's much more ahead. Now, there's a question we haven't addressed yet, and it may be the most important one. Why now? Why is this happening in our time, specifically? Because the shadow has always been with us. Mass-mindedness is not new. So what is it about this particular moment in history that makes us so vulnerable? Jung had an answer, and it goes deeper than politics, deeper than technology. It goes to the very foundation of how human beings orient themselves in the world. He observed that we are living through what the ancient Greeks would have called a metamorphosis of the gods. Now, let me explain what he meant by that, because this is profound and it's widely misunderstood. Throughout human history, civilizations have been held together by shared symbolic frameworks, myths, religions, sacred narratives that gave individuals a sense of meaning, belonging, and moral orientation. Now, these weren't merely stories people believed. Jung understood them as something far more significant. They were psychological structures. They anchored the individual to something larger than the crowd, larger than the state, larger than any political movement. They provided what Jung called an extra-mundane principle, and a point of reference beyond the merely social and political. something that allowed a person to stand apart from the mass and say, "No, there is something higher than this. There is something truer than what the crowd is telling me." Jung wrote, "We are living in what the Greeks called the right time for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious man within us who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science." Now here is the critical point, and this is what I really need you to understand. When these symbolic structures collapse, when a civilization loses its guiding myth, the individual doesn't simply become a free thinker. That is the rationalist fantasy. That is what the modern world tells itself. That we have outgrown myth, outgrown religion, outgrown the need for symbolic life, and now we are free. But what Jung observed, clinically, empirically, in patient after patient, and in culture after culture, was the opposite. The individual becomes unmoored, psychologically naked, exposed to every psychic wind that blows. And then something entirely predictable happens. Jung put it with devastating simplicity. He wrote, "You can take away a man's gods, but only to give him others in return. The gods don't disappear. They never disappear. They transform. And when people can no longer find meaning in genuine symbolic life, in authentic inner experience, they grasp for substitutes. Political ideologies become religions. Party leaders become prophets. Online tribes become congregations. Outrage becomes prayer. Cancellation becomes excommunication. And because these substitutes lack the depth of genuine symbolic experience, because they operate at the surface of the psyche rather than in its depths, they don't satisfy, they don't anchor, they only inflame. And the cycle accelerates. People become more frantic, more desperate, more certain that if they could just defeat the right enemy, convert the right people, win the right argument, they would finally feel whole. But they never do, because what they're actually missing isn't political victory. It's contact with their own depths. Jung saw this coming. He warned about a rootless consciousness that would succumb helplessly to all manner of suggestions and become susceptible to psychic epidemics. We're living in it. So, if this is what's happening, if we are living through exactly the kind of psychic epidemic Jung warned about, what do we do? What did Jung say? Was the answer. And here is where Jung parts ways with almost every other thinker of his century. He didn't look to politics for the solution. He didn't look to institutions. He didn't place his faith in movements or reforms or revolutions, because he understood, from decades of clinical experience, that these are precisely the mechanisms of mass-mindedness. You don't heal a collective sickness with more collectivism. You don't cure a psychic epidemic by joining a bigger crowd. Jung's answer was the individual, specifically the inner work of the individual. He called this process individuation, and he considered it the most important task any human being could undertake, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of the world. He wrote, "It is, unfortunately, only too clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either, for society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption." That sentence has haunted me for decades. Society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption, not in need of better policies, not in need of the right leader, in need of redemption, individual, inner, psychological redemption. Now, what does this look like in practice? Because Jung was not an abstract thinker. He was a clinician. He worked with real people, and he was specific about what the work requires. So let me be specific with you. First, You must confront your own shadow. This is non-negotiable. It is where everything begins. Before you diagnose the world's madness, you must ask yourself, honestly, where am I projecting? Who am I demonizing? What qualities in others trigger the most disproportionate reaction in me? And what does that reveal about what I've buried in myself? When you feel that surge of moral certainty, that intoxicating sense that you are right and they are wrong, and there's nothing more to examine, that is precisely the moment to look inward. Jung said, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole personality. Engaging with it requires what he called considerable moral effort. This is not comfortable work. It is not supposed to be comfortable. It is supposed to be honest. Second, withdraw your projections. Every time you feel absolute certainty that the problem is entirely out there, in that group, in that person, in that ideology, pause. Just pause. Jung said that if you're brave enough to withdraw all your projections, you'll encounter a pretty, thick shadow. Good. That's the beginning of consciousness. That thickness, that discomfort, that is the raw material of your own becoming. Don't run from it. Third, resist the pull of the crowd. And I know this may be the hardest one, because mass-mindedness is seductive. It feels like belonging. It feels like moral clarity. It feels like strength. But Jung was unequivocal. The individual who merges with the mass loses exactly the capacities, reflection, moral judgment, independent thought that could protect them from psychic contagion. You must learn to stand alone when necessary, not out of arrogance, not out of superiority, out of psychological integrity, out of a commitment to being a whole person rather than a fraction of a mob. And fourth, cultivate genuine inner life. This is perhaps the most important and the most neglected. Jung said the individual needs what he called inner, transcendent experience to resist being swallowed by the mass. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean formal religion, though it can. What it means is developing a living relationship with your own unconscious, through paying attention to your dreams, through genuine reflection, not the performative kind you do for social media, but the kind you do in silence, alone, when no one is watching. Through honest self-examination, and through whatever practice connects you to something deeper than the noise of collective opinion. Because here is what Jung understood. The individual who has a relationship with their own depths cannot be easily possessed by the collective. The person who has confronted their own darkness doesn't need to find it in others. The human being who has found genuine meaning, not borrowed meaning, not the meaning handed to them by their tribe or their feed, but meaning they've earned through their own inner work, that person becomes a point of stillness in a world that has lost its mind. And that matters more than you know. I want to leave you with one final thought. When Jung looked at the chaos of his own century, 2 world wars, the rise of totalitarianism, the industrialization of cruelty on a scale the world had never seen, and he did not despair, but he also did not offer easy comfort. He understood that the fate of civilization doesn't rest on elections or policies or revolutions. It rests on something far more fragile and far more powerful. He wrote, "The salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul." That is not a poetic sentiment. It is a clinical observation from a man who spent his entire life studying what happens when the individual psyche is neglected. When the inner world goes dark, the outer world follows. Always, without exception. That is the lesson of the 20th century. That is the lesson Jung spent his life trying to teach us. The world may be going through exactly the kind of crisis he predicted, but you are not helpless in the face of it. Every act of honest self-examination, every projection you withdraw, and every moment you choose reflection over reaction, consciousness over contagion, every time you refuse to let the crowd think for you, you are doing the only work that has ever actually healed a civilization, not from the top down, from the inside out. Jung understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone who has ever lived, that darkness cannot be defeated by fighting it in others. It can only be transformed by bringing it to light within yourself. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That is the work. That has always been the work. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.